Mary Bridges Center for Labor Studies and the Labor Solidarity Project at the University of Washington-Tacoma. I'd like to welcome everyone back to the final installment of our fall seminar series, Working Together. And as we wrap this quarter, I just wanted to take a second and send a special thank you to those of you who've been here week in and week out over the quarter and actually over the last 2 years. I know this has been and it continues to be a really challenging time for so many of us, and I hope that you found some kind of comfort or inspiration in this programming. I know I have, right? I was just talking to our guest tonight, and I think that this is kind of like one of the few good things to emerge out of like the Zoomification of nearly every aspect of my life. And I think what it's allowed us to do is to reach out and connect with activists and scholars who we might otherwise not have been able to invite onto campus for kind of a live event. So speaking of activists and scholars, I'm really excited about tonight's speaker, who's joining us all the way from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and is here to provide some answers to questions that many labor historians and I think many American workers, especially right now, have struggled with in recent histories. And I think these are some big questions. These are some existential questions that have been troubling American labor for a long time. And I think the main one is like, how did we get here, right? How did we arrive at a situation where 50 years ago, nearly a third of American workers belong to a union, and today that figure's closer to 1 in 10. That just kind of begs the question of where exactly did everything go wrong for American labor, and as we look forward, how can we learn lessons from that past and maybe build a stronger labor movement that fights for all workers moving forward? And I think our guest tonight explores these questions by focusing on what's really a pivotal yet comparatively understudied era in American labor history, and that's the 1970s. Our work explores this transitional moment and how the promises and the progress of the 60s, the civil rights movement, women's rights movement, Chicano movement, how all of that transformed into the nightmare of Reaganomics and the kind of the neoliberal turn that it heralded, right? And I think the dominant narrative has always been that this was a transformation that was kind of just a product of globalization. It was kind of a natural thing. It was kind of like the logical next step in capitalism. But I think, as we'll see tonight, when you actually take a closer look, the story becomes a heck of a lot more complicated. And I think it's a story that really requires, an honest and an introspective look into how issues of, the racism and sexism compromised, the American labor movement really kind of from within. So our guest tonight, Dr. Lane Windham, revisits this story in her work, Knocking on Labor's Door, Union Organizing in the 1970s and the Roots of a New Economic Divide. And this is a book which won the 2018 David Montgomery Award, an annual prize awarded for the best book in the topic of American labor and working class history. In addition to being an award-winning author, Dr. Windham is an experienced organizer, educator, historian, and activist with nearly 20 years of experience working in the labor movement. She's currently the associate director at the Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor at Georgetown University, also the director of Will and Power, an ambitious collaborative project with Rutgers University that promotes women's leadership in the labor movement and the struggle for economic justice. And despite all that, you found time to Zoom in tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lane Windham for joining us tonight and being a part of this series. And I will say, hardcore LSP fans may recognize Lane from her work in the PBS documentary 9 to 5, The Story of a Movement, which we actually screened earlier this year.
Excellent. Yeah, I was going to mention that in my talk. So good to know that y'all have seen it.
Yeah, we had Adair Damon was in the film and joined us for a conversation, including a panel of other folks involved. So I'm just, again, as always, excited to provide a platform for your work, which I think is just really incredibly important. It answered, for me personally, a lot of questions I had about kind of that narrative of American labor history, and how we got from point A to point C, like that very important decade in between. So we had, as always, students have submitted some questions ahead of time, but if you're in the audience and you have questions, feel free to pose them in the chat board. I think what we're going to do, Lane has a presentation, and then we'll kind of hand it over to Q&A. With that said, again, thank you for being here.
Terrific. Well, thanks to the University of Washington Tacoma's Labor Solidarity Project for having me. I always love to talk worker power, especially right now when so much is hopping. There's a lot going on. I look forward to a good discussion tonight, and I'd love to hear from you all about what's happening in your area, because I don't know what's happening in Washington State right now. So thanks, Alex, for organizing this. I also shout out to my fellow University of Maryland alum, Will Burgart, who I saw on here. Good to see you. So this book talk is extremely timely for a couple of reasons. The pandemic has lifted up issues of race, gender, and class. It's more clear than ever the vital role that essential workers in our society and economy play. And of course, many of those essential workers are women or people of color. And the pandemic has made this invisible workforce extremely visible. Too often when we think about a union member, we think about a white guy in a hard hat, right? But America's working class is largely female and disproportionately Black and brown. Our public narrative about the working class and unions is flawed because it's based on an incomplete historical narrative. Just like Alex was saying, getting from A to C, right? So today we're going to work a little bit on correcting that narrative. And this book talk is also really timely because I think we are living through a kind of moment of a worker rights revival of some sort. You see it in worker activity, the strikes, the union organizing, right? The Gallup polling that shows that 68% of Americans say that they're supportive of unions. That's the highest rate since 1965. In addition to that, young people are the most likely to say that they are interested in unions. 77% of 18 to 34-year-olds say that they are supportive of unions. So, many of you probably are in that age range. Lots of people are they're fed up with the bad jobs that they have been asked to work for too long, for 40 years. We've built an economy on low wages and bad jobs, and so people are also staying home in record numbers. The economists talk about the Great Resignation. Well, let's call it what it is, which is a slow-moving general strike, I think. And it's pretty extraordinary what we're living through, and that's especially true of women who we've asked to juggle work and unpaid care. But in order to talk about how we got here, right, to this moment, let's back up and we'll talk about the book, talk about the 1970s, which gives us a very different narrative than the standard one. And I'm going to share my screen, and this is going to go seamlessly. Let's see. Yes. There we go. Are you, Alex, can you see it? Everybody? Yes. Okay, good. Okay, let me get situated here. Okay, so in order to understand how workers got to their present crisis, you have to understand the 1970s. You have to look at how working people have contested for power within a transforming capitalism over the last 4 decades or more. So let's start there and talk about how working people fought for power. And I'm going to do a spoiler here. They lost in the pivotal 1970s. But that struggle is extremely important in that decade because that economy and that struggle in many ways set the stage. Okay. Yes. Historians are clear that the 1970s were pivotal years. At the beginning of the decade, things were looking really good for workers. Real incomes had roughly doubled since the 1940s. Income inequality was low. About a quarter of workers were in unions. But then things started to change. There's a lot more global competition. US companies see that their rate of profit is slowing. There'd been slowdowns before, but what happens in the 70s is different. It's a shift to what I call a new economic divide. When wages stopped rising along with productivity, they had gone up together, right? But then they diverge in the 1970s. And working people don't share in the later recoveries. And union membership, of course, takes a very sharp turn downward. And by the mid 80s, private sector union density is down to 14%. Today, in the private sector, only 6% of working people are in a union, which is a historic low. Okay, so when explaining this decline, right, many academics and journalists place the blame squarely on what they portray as bureaucratic unions, which they say were complacent, on working people who they thought say, well, they lost interest in organized labor. This is a direct quote from a textbook. No great organizing drives were undertaken by major national unions and the AFL-CIO itself for decades, right? So one historian even says that in the 1970s, these are the last days of the working class. But, I've been a union organizer, and that didn't seem right to me because I know that people have wanted to form unions and they can't because it's incredibly difficult to do in this country. So I started to take a closer look at the numbers. I didn't just count yes votes when I started to research National Labor Relations Board elections. I counted all the people who tried to form unions, whether they won or not. And that decision in many ways is at the core of this book because it allows me to tell a different story than what other historians tell. Well, it turns out that roughly 5 million workers voted in board elections in the 1970s, 500,000 a year, the same rate as in labor's heyday in the 1950s and 1960s. What you're looking at here is the number of voters in labor board elections from 1949 to 1999. And what we're talking about is that sort of hump in the middle when workers continued to vote in these elections. And by the way, this doesn't even include public sector workers. Another 3 million workers voted in public sector elections during this decade. So, in fact, there's a wave of millions of working people who came knocking on labor's door in the 70s. They tried to organize, including throughout the South, and many of the people leading these drives were women, people of color who were just entering the workforce. They had long been excluded from the nation's best jobs and from many of the nation's unions, but they'd won new access through the 1964 Civil Rights Act. This isn't the last days of the working class, right? These are the first days of a transformed, diversified, and newly activated working class. For many years, a lot of scholars talk about how the rights consciousness of the 60s and 70s eclipsed ideas about class and labor. But I think this interpretation is very narrowly framed because, ironically, it centers white men as the proper representative of labor and didn't see the millions of women and people of color who were outside the unions trying to get in. And in fact, as these women and people of color, many of them young, as they came into these new jobs, they demanded unions, right? They didn't just want a job, any job, they wanted a good job. And so they tried to form unions. So there are workers like Henry Davison, who's pictured here with his family. He left his hometown of Monroe, Louisiana in 1965 because he couldn't find anyone willing to hire a Black man at a decent wage. He returned home in 1976 and started working at a GM plant that did not have a union, and he organized it. He's pictured here with his coworkers on the right. And there's lots of surprising union victories in this decade. Workers at the Midwest Stock Exchange, hospital workers, security guards at Pinkerton, the notorious strike-breaking firm, formed a union in the 70s. Board statistics don't tell us anything about the race and gender of workers. However, so for that, I had to interview workers. I looked at polling and news accounts and dusty union records and actually Unionbuster records. And that's where I found a lot of the story. Women were key. They powered the new wave of union organizing. Women poured into the nation's workplaces in the 1970s. There were 12 million more women working by the end of the decade, and many joined unions. In 1960, only 18% of union members were women. By 1984, that figure was 34%. Women were, by the way, on track to be a majority of union members in this country by 2025, but that was before the pandemic. And so I haven't actually seen new statistics. My hunch is it's probably changed a little bit. Black workers were by far the most likely to say that they wanted a union. It's very important to recognize that many unions were still reluctant to accept Black members. Unions were very slow to open up staff and leadership positions to Black workers, but many Black workers had to file EEOC charges just to win equal access. But they wanted unions. A full 70% of African-American blue-collar workers said they would form a union if given a chance. And the AFL-CIO estimated that during this period, 1 out of every 3 new union members was African-American. Hispanic workers were more likely than the general population to be in a union. This image is from the FARA clothing campaign and boycott in Texas. 3,000 mostly native-born Hispanic workers, mostly women, walked out demanding union recognition. There was a 2-year-long strike, a big consumer boycott, and it eventually brought a very reluctant management to the table. So the book features 4 case studies that I chose in part because they countered specific aspects of the standard historical narrative. And so I'm just going to sort of walk you through the case studies, and if I'm just going to give you a tiny little bit of it. And if we want to discuss them more in detail, I'm happy to do that. So standard narrative says working people were losing interest in unions. They were turned off by union bureaucracy. And according to this narrative, unions missed the boat on the new energy of the civil rights and women's movements. And historians often treat these movements as separate. But actually, when you get down to the workplace level, labor and civil rights struggles are deeply intertwined in real people's lives, right? They're literally embodied in the same person. The first case study features a union organizing victory at Newport News shipyard in Virginia, where a group of 4 African-American men won 2 landmark EEOC cases, 1966 and in 1970. By the late 70s, these same men, including Oscar Pretlow and Ellis Cofield, who are pictured here, turned to the United Steelworkers when those laws were still not enough to help them win good pay and security. They sparked a union campaign and a board election among 19,000 workers that was the largest ever in the South and the largest board election in the 1970s. These workers didn't choose between civil rights and labor. They used both in tandem. They were using whatever tool they could get that would help them win and gain power. When workers at Newport News couldn't get a contract, they struck for 82 days. Part of that was a wildcat strike, which prompted this violent police reaction. But maybe Newport News, maybe it was an outlier, right? They made Navy ships. Navy ships had to be built in the US. So maybe these workers were different and they could organize because they were outside the pressures of globalization. So another piece of the standard narrative for labor's decline is that as capitalism globalized, workers sort of automatically and naturally just lost power. Well, actually, globalization is neither neutral nor natural. It's created by human actors, and companies routinely used globalization as a weapon to keep workers from organizing. So in the second case study, I examined union elections in another Southern industrial setting, Cannon Mills in Kannapolis, North Carolina. For years, African-American workers were excluded from textile plants, yet they began to come into the textile plants in the 1960s and 70s once federal law demanded it. And they began organizing unions really as soon as they started coming in. So there's an election at Cannon Mills, which is this huge anti-union behemoth in Kannapolis, North Carolina. And in this election in 1974, globalization had not really yet kicked in. It wasn't as much of a threat in the textile industry yet. But the company used other threats, like trying to paint the union as an outsider from the North. Black workers did not fall for that. And people were shocked when these Southern workers very nearly voted in a union in this town, which was in the heart of, the anti-union South. But then in 1985, in a second election, the company used a globalizing economy as a threat to keep those workers from unionizing, and imports was the big theme. And the company's threats worked, even though half of the workers had indicated that they wanted a union and had signed union cards. By the end of the campaign, the union was defeated 2-1. Globalization is never a natural or neutral process, right? It's shaped by people who make real-time decisions. And in this case, the company used it as a threat to keep the workers from forming a union. Okay, but Newport News and Cannon Mills were industrial settings. And, a lot of the analysts talk about how the job market since the 1970s has shifted to retail, to service. So another part of the standard narrative is, well, unions shrunk because they did too little to organize in service and retail. But actually, retail and service workers did try to form unions, but they faced a wall of resistance from employers. So to get at that sector, the third case study is on a department store in Washington, D.C. It no longer exists. It's called Woodward and Lothrop, or Woody's, which was a historic institution. And workers there formed a union with Local 400 of the United Food and Commercial Workers. Very diverse group, majority female, young, many women of color. It was DC's largest labor board election in history, and they won. These workers actually overcame the employer union busting resistance. Other retail workers in the area were not able to overcome that resistance. And in fact, workers at Macy's in Washington, D.C. have a union today, and it's the legacy of this group. And finally, in the fourth case study, I look at the service sector, and I feature 9 to 5, which you said that you saw the movie. And I'm so interested by this group because these women who were secretaries in the Boston area, both formed an association called 9 to 5, as pictured there. That's Karen Nussbaum. And they also formed a union, which was local SEIU with the numbers 925 or District 925. And they used both of those forms of power, a union based in collective bargaining, an association that built power in other ways outside of collective bargaining. They used them in tandem. And of course, SEIU 925, we probably have some members of that group with us tonight. And the legacy of the union side of that is the Washington State local. And I'm so excited that you all saw the new documentary. If anybody missed it, it's now on Netflix. And it's called 9 to 5, The Story of a Movement. And I urge you to see it because it's a fabulous documentary by Julia Reichert and Steve Bodner, who made the film on your factory. So I'm telling you this story about, all these people who are organizing. Some of them are winning. There seems to be lots of activity. So what happened? If so many people wanted unions, then why didn't the labor movement grow? So there's lots of reasons for this. Globalization, technological change certainly mattered, but the fact that workers couldn't freely form unions also was very important. What I discovered is that unions were organizing, and many workers wanted unions, but what declined was their ability to form unions. I'm just going to, many of you know this, but I'm going to remind you of the onerous process for forming a union through the National Labor Relations Board in this country. So to get a union, first, 30% of workers have to sign union cards. Usually the organizers wait until at least half have signed. You then take these to the government. You then wait 8 to 12 weeks for an election. And during this time, the employer has free access to hold meetings and campaign against the union. The union has no access inside the workplace. The vast majority of employers fight the effort. About a third fire workers, over half threaten to move, about half threaten to cut wages and benefits. Only once workers have gone through this process and still voted for a union is their employer required to sit down and negotiate for a contract. While employers have never been thrilled to have unions, they dramatically increased their resistance to unions in the 1970s. And they did so in large part because they faced a crisis of profit and a newly globalized and financialized capitalism. Labor costs were something they could more easily control. So as Douglas Souter put it, he was the co-founder of the Business Roundtable in the 1970s. People began looking for ways to economize and found out that they had given it away in the contract, right? And so employers began to shut the door on new union organizing. And three things change on this front. First, employers became far more willing to bend and break the law. The number of what we call unfair labor practice charges against employers doubled in this decade, as did the number of illegal firings. You're looking here at the number of unfair labor practices from the 1950s through the 90s, and you see that steep rise right there in the 70s through the 80s. The second thing that happened is even unionized employers at the core of the economy, companies like GM, US Steel, Goodrich, began to viciously fight their workers' efforts to unionize. And finally, employers began to rely much more heavily on Unionbusters, who closely advised employers on how to thwart unionizing attempts, including educating managers on the low costs of skirting and breaking the law. There's no fines. Why don't you just break the law, right? They also bred fear about the new levels of women and people of color in the workforce, and they used this diverse workforce to gin up business. So, for instance, Martin J. Levitt, who wrote a book called Confessions of a Union Buster, talked about how he and his employer, called 3M, capitalized on the wave of organizing among African-American women. 3M developed training tactics to, quote, according to Martin J. Levitt, awaken within the mostly white supervisor corps a hatred of Blacks, contempt for women, mistrust of the poor, end quote. So, historians and pundits have been unclear about a newly diversified working class, but managers and corporations were very clear, and their efforts were extremely effective. While workers won roughly 80% of union elections in the 1940s, by the late 1970s, they had won less than half. So it's important, I think, to pause here and ask why. Why are employers fighting so hard to keep workers from forming a union, right? It's about power in the workplace, certainly. But while US employers had long resisted unions, their anti-union efforts dramatically escalated in this decade. And I think part of it is that employers had a huge incentive to resist union organizing because of the particular role that collective bargaining plays within the US's employer-centric social welfare system. Much of our social safety net, our pensions, our healthcare come through our employers, right? And we developed this employer-provided social safety net after World War II. It's different in other countries. The social safety net there is either provided universally to all citizens, or they say to their employers, you have to provide it, right? We never did that. We never required employers to provide these social benefits. Instead, all we said is we require you, employer, to negotiate over these social benefits with all workers who have jumped through all these hoops to get a union, right? So our system relies on unions and collective bargaining to do the kind of redistribution and social safety network that governments do elsewhere. And we are in this country right now in the midst of a very interesting discussion inspired by the crisis of the pandemic, in which we are finally reevaluating and debating many of the aspects of our employer-provided social safety net. In many ways, our social safety net got so weak and pitiful in this country because we built it on unions and collective bargaining, saying, okay, you pull all that out of employers. And then we spent the rest of the century undercutting unions and collective bargaining, so they couldn't do that, right? So, well, how did that happen? When the employers faced a crisis of profit in the 1970s, they wanted out of their social welfare obligations. Well, the best way out, right, is to avoid the one entity that can legally force you to play that role, which is a union and collective bargaining. So when employers attacked union organizing in the 1970s, they did far more than bust unions. They busted a cornerstone of our nation's employer-provided social compact. So the employer assault on unions was part of their overall attack on the entire employment relationship. They began hiring far more part-time workers. They moved to contractors. They stopped providing benefits. This evolved into the gig economy. And we've seen this shift over the last several decades in how our economy works. And it started in the 70s. And resisting union organizing was part of that shift. And so, I think that the challenge for workers and labor right now is to build a new social compact that centers working people's issues and also includes working people issues that have traditionally been outside of the purview of collective bargaining, like unemployment, base wage, paid family leave, and housing. And it's no coincidence that we are having this debate about a social compact against the background of some of the most potent labor unrest in 40 years. Working people are making waves. I think we don't know yet what's going to happen with the second social infrastructure bill, but I think working people have already changed the conversation and by refusing to take those horrible jobs. But okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. We're still, oh, wait. I don't know how to go back. How do I go back? There? No. Maybe here? Yes. Okay. Let's see. Okay, going back. We're still in the 1980s. Let's go back there. By the early 1980s, corporations had created such a culture of fear that they had effectively closed the door on new union organizing. And there's a downturn to organizing from which we've never really recovered, right? So this is when the wave I'm describing kind of ends. But let's just pause for a moment. In September of 1981, for Solidarity Day, labor, of course, at that moment didn't know what turbulent times lay ahead. But on September 19th, 1981, the labor movement staged its largest protest in history, Solidarity Day. If there's anybody here who was there, I would love to hear from you. You can put a note in the chat or speak up in the discussion. Maybe somebody was. Historians have generally ignored this march. A number of textbooks don't even cover it. About 400,000 people marched in a protest that was comparable to the 1963 March on Washington. Participants rode in on 3,000 chartered buses, a dozen specially chartered Amtrak trains. The AFL-CIO subsidized the entire metro system that day. I looked at lots of photos of this group, and I think that the group was far more diverse than it would have been even 20 years before. The Civil Rights Act transformed not only America's workplaces, but also the labor movement. But the tide soon turned, and not in the direction the marchers had hoped, for a number of reasons. There's a steep recession in the early 80s. There are job losses that are concentrated in unionized manufacturing and construction. Auto and the steelworker unions each lose 400,000 members in a 5-year span, 1979 to 84. That's about a third of their membership. Reagan, of course, is elected. He fires the striking air traffic controllers. This helps chill organizing. He also appoints a labor board that's very hostile to organizing. But in the face of all of this, and after a decade of increased employer resistance to union organizing, unions do begin to pull back from organizing. And you see that very quick drop from about 1980 down to 1983. While about 500,000 had tried to form a union each year in the 70s, by 83, it's down to 165,000. Currently, these days, between 50 and 75,000 workers usually try each year. By the 1990s, when I was organizing, this wave that I'm describing to you was over. We were still organizing, right? And there were new forms like Jobs with Justice and Justice with Janitors, but labor board elections were never again at that 1970s scale. Because our nation's labor laws were so weak, employers effectively closed off the gateway to this most secure social safety net, a union contract. And this helped create the economic insecurity and division which we have today. Well, I'm pretty much done with this. So let me stop the share. Okay. So knocking on labor's door basically shows how historians have been telling an incomplete story about how the US labor movement got to its present crisis. The history is not wholly wrong, but it's distorted. Working people didn't acquiesce, right? Their collective struggle didn't just fade away. A newly diversified working class demanded full access to unions and made a massive push for economic equality and prosperity. They fought and they lost. And fighting and losing is a very different thing than not fighting at all. It's not that workers didn't want unions, it's that the tools they had to form them, labor board elections, had become increasingly weak. The people are fine. The people are, out there striking. Many of them are trying to use these tools, but the tools are broken. We need to fix labor law. We need to reimagine collective bargaining. And I think that we also have to re-envision the entire social and that the role for labor is not only to deal with issues that are covered by collective bargaining. I think that workers today are using multiple tools. We can talk more about this. They are continuing to use unions and collective bargaining, but they're experimenting with all kinds of new forms of worker power too, which is exciting. And I think is exactly what they need to be doing. So that's the presentation, and I am excited to take some of your questions and hear from you all.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Join me again. A round of digital applause for Laine. This is fantastic work. Excellent summary of the book that kind of previews but doesn't quite give it all away. Great teaser. I just think your observation of this kind of like the distorted history, the incomplete story. I love that the way you phrased that this wasn't sort of the end of the working class, but the first days of a new working class. It's just a really great way to think about it. And I think the way you conclude with kind of a consideration of just kind of the deterioration of the social safety net, which, it's also the removal of that social compact, but also just like the social contract, right? It's like I keep thinking of like Barbara Ehrenreit's Nickel and Dimed, where it's like, there's something horribly wrong with a system where people can work, more than one full-time job and still be, struggling to put food on the table. So I just, again, really love this book and just so glad you could join us for this evening's conversation. Apparently, we've got a couple questions added to the chat board here. And I did want to acknowledge the fact that Michael Honey was at Solidarity Day. I can see him. He's on the camera now. So
Hey,
if
Michael, how are you?
I wonder, I can actually let me see if I can unmute Michael, and maybe he can give a quick synopsis of Solidarity Day from the perspective of someone who was there in person. Um,
I'm not all surprised that Mike Honey was at
yeah, I
Solidarity
was
Day.
gonna say, why am I
I'd
not
be
surprised
surprised if
that
he
he was
wasn't.
Hi, Lane. It's really great to see you. I knew we'd get you to Tacoma eventually in this funny kind of way. A couple of things occurred. I read your book, quite a while ago, of course, and wrote a review of it. But it's a wonderful book. But as you were talking, a couple of things came to me. One was I was in the South in the 1970s, from 70 to 76, and the Southern Patriot magazine of the Southern Conference Educational Fund is full of articles about local struggles all over the place, really tough ones too. And reading back, I'm writing a book about that period, and reading back over the newspaper reminded me of what a tough period that was. And it was in the South. I mean, Southern workers were really fighting back. And the tragedy that you show in your book is that they had no support, from the labor law, and it got worse. And the other thing that came to me with your talking about Solidarity Day was it was fantastic. I mean, it was huge, but there were a whole bunch of huge rallies and marches in the 80s against Reaganism. Remember his nuclear brinkmanship, and we had these gigantic anti-nuclear demonstrations too. So the problem we had, and I remember this during that Solidarity Day, was I thought, okay, now what's the follow-up? We've got this huge rally here, but where's the organization?
Yeah.
Yeah, and
I don't think labor had it then. Yeah.
It didn't. I mean, and we were kind of cynical, I think, some of us in the left out there, because we were thinking, okay, this is great, but where's the organizing?
Yeah, and it's really not until the late 80s that the labor movement starts to really experiment with things like justice for janitors, right? Or jobs with justice, or to try to experiment with new forms. They still were used to having lots of power in the early 80s, and it was a shock what was happening. I don't think they knew what to do.
Yeah. We still had Lane Kirkland, who really, he just didn't get it. He didn't know what era he was in. That was bad.
Actually, that sort of reminds me of a question that was posed ahead of time by one of the students. I mean, national labor isn't totally off the hook in terms of the decline, right? They're not sort of above reproach. And some of the students were kind of interested in hearing a little bit more about how at the national level, many unions kind of did work against their own best interests during the 50s and the 60s to sort of create the preconditions that led to that dramatic decline. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure, I'm happy to. So, what I would say is that yes, there were lots of unions that weren't organizing enough. That is certainly true. However, the story is more complicated than the standard narrative. The standard narrative for a long time has been, oh, if and this was what I was taught. Those union guys, if they had just been willing to get out there and organize a little more, that would have done it. And I just don't think that's true. I think that doesn't take into account all the structural issues that were loaded against these workers who tried to form unions. And when we say labor, it's not just the white guy who was running the union, right? It's also Oscar Pretlow. It's also the people who I showed you pictures of, right? They are also labor. And so, for instance, at Newport News, let me give you an example. So there you had 4 African-American men who basically started this organizing campaign. They called the steelworkers, and they had the organizing director from the steelworkers, a guy named Elmer Chaddock, who came to Newport News, and he was reluctant to start to support their effort. They actually had a sort of company union, which they were going to try to throw out. And he said, if you come to me with, basically a third of the cards that you would need, then we'll start to talk. And that group of men began to hold meetings in the community. They organized and just night after night after night, they held meetings and they got the cards. And they basically pushed the United Steelworkers into going to taking the thing to an election. And so in that case, the union was sort of reluctantly coming along, but they did back it. And they did back the big strike that these workers had in 1979 with, strike pay, et cetera, et cetera. But really the people who were pushing it were the worker activists. And when we say labor, we also mean those labor worker activists, right? We're all included when we say the word labor.
Excellent, thanks. We actually have another guest tonight, a former LSP participant, Zack Patton, who had a question, and I promised I would unmute him. So let's see if this works.
Hey everyone, my name is Zack, he, him. I'm a longshoreman at the Port of Tacoma, UW-T grad as well. Hey Mike. Lane, my question for you, I guess I actually have two of them. One, I was curious to know amongst, so your book kind of, like you said at the start of the presentation tonight, like objects to certain kind of standards in the narrative about labor in this period. One, I was curious what the response from other scholars, maybe even including people like Jefferson Cowie or people who you make kind of like nods to in your objections, like what the response from other historians has been to your work. And secondly, I'm curious to know, given like this upsurge in interest in organized labor, things like Striketober, the reform effort in the Teamsters Union, the one member, one vote thing that just passed today with the United Auto Workers, workers organizing and fighting back in Amazon, all sorts of different things, right? I'm curious to know, like, what do you think is like the one big takeaway from your book in this period in general that young workers looking to organize their own workplace can take away from that? Thank you.
Okay. I will answer that, Zack, but then I want to hear from you what's happening there at the ports. So I want to hear that too. So, okay, the reaction to the book, how, I guess a couple of things. One is that I have found that, the book's been out for a while. It came out in 2017. So you don't really know how a book, like what it's going to do in terms of the historiography. But what I'm finding is that people are using this book as a stepping stone to get out of that old narrative and get into a new one where they can talk about a more diversified working class. And I'm sure, Mike, you probably find that they use your books for that too, right? To basically allow you to talk about the marriage of the labor movement and the civil rights movement rather than those being torn apart. And so people who understand that, who are studying that, use it to help get them there. However, the people who, when I have heard criticism of the book, for instance, there was a roundtable in the journal Labor that discussed the book. A lot of the discussion centers on they would say things like, well, the white men and the unions who were part of the unions didn't want the women, or they didn't want the people of color to be in their union. And so their racism and sexism, that's what really caused the decline in labor. And my answer to that is yes, there was lots of racism and there was lots of sexism in unions. This book, this discussion is not about white men, right? I'm not trying to explain the white men who are already part of the unions. I think that we should do that. I think we need to study them more because I think they are more complicated than that narrative allows them to be. For instance, I found in my work that a lot of the times the white men in union organizing campaigns would actually follow the leadership of Black women, and sort of the Black women would be leading and they would follow and be part of the organizing campaigns, right? And so I think that that people have had a hard time of letting go of the idea of that when we say labor, we mean white men, and that the people who are ready to let go of that and to understand labor in a more diverse way are using the book. And I find, frankly, that younger people are more willing to do that and get it a lot quicker in some ways than the boomer generation. So in terms of your second question, in terms of this moment, what I think that the book says to young people who are organizing at Starbucks, at Amazon, who organized at Vice, who organized at Gawker, who are organizing on so many college campuses with United Campus Workers and other groups. We are definitely in a very exciting moment. And I think what I hope that they'll take away from Knocking on Labor's Door, because many of them are young, they're people of color, they're women, it's a diverse group that is leading today's worker activism. I want them to understand that there were people like them who had fought 40 years ago, and that they are part of a legacy of a struggle, and that they are part of a long history of people standing up for their rights, and a diverse group doing that. One of my most exciting moments was when the current director of Jobs with Justice, a woman named Erica Smiley, an African-American young woman, said to me, for the first time when I read your book, I saw myself in labor history. And that was maybe one of the most meaningful things that someone said to me. So that's my hope. But Zach, but you tell us what's happening there in terms of the happening on the ports or happening in workplaces there.
Thank you for that. That's great. Well, a lot. I mean, I think anybody that's been following the news, even kind of loosely, every single day, there's another crisis story about the supply chain, and it's the end of the world, and blah, 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 right? And all eyes are especially on the port of LA Long Beach, which handles like 40% of like the imports into the US economy from overseas. It's been kind of a mixed bag, like up and down the coast, but there's like a totally unprecedented backlog of cargo here in Tacoma as well. We've seen it slowed down like a little bit in the last couple of weeks, but especially in the spring and summer, just like absolute unprecedented levels of work, like long time, very seasoned, experienced longshoremen who have been around for 30 or 40 years have, remarked that they've never seen anything like this, with just the amount of like work opportunities, and so just work around the clock and trying to handle all the cargo that's coming in and find some place to put it. But I guess if I have the platform to talk about this real quick, right? Our contract is expiring on July 1st of next year. We're currently on a 3-year extension off of a 5-year contract. That 5-year agreement is the longest that we've ever had in 80 plus years. We've definitely never had a 3-year extension on top of something like that. So we're talking about like something that's also totally unprecedented for us and how we negotiate with our employers who make up the Pacific Maritime Association, or PMA, which is they like to kind of thumb their nose at us and call it an employers union, I think just to piss us off. but they're a group that represents all the shipping and stevedoring companies on the West Coast. But we're supposed to go into negotiations in the spring, which have been contentious a couple different times in the last 20 years. In particular, we were locked out for 10 days in 2002. Negotiations in 2014 stretched into the next year, and there was like a series of I'll just say like skirmishes like on the docks, and lots of disruptions kind of maybe coming from both sides, at least allegedly, about on the waterfront. And so anyway, it was messy, and there was a lot of cargo backup back then. But so pointing to those kinds of things, our employers recently made an offer to give us a 1-year extension on top of the 3 that we're already under. Every single president of every longshore local up and down the entire West Coast recently unanimously said no to that. So we're not going to extend our contract, and we are going to go into bargaining. But now employers are already getting on it and publishing stories in every outlet they can that, of course, always talk about how much we make. And it's always, which is a lot, to be fair. Like, I know that. Like, I think most people who follow labor politics know that our contract does quite well for longshore workers, but they always give these absolutely just sky high, astronomical, inflated, phony numbers to make us look like we're filthy rich and try to spin public opinion against us, or trying to frame us as being selfish and putting the national economy in an already precarious supply chain at risk, or further at risk. But it's been interesting. I'll just say, I don't know, I've been kind of going on for a little bit while, but one of the things that COVID-19 and the pandemic has really exposed and revealed about the workplace is actually like showing like who actually is the supply chain. I think the Bessemer organizing drive in Alabama, and then when that Evergreen ship got stuck in the Suez Canal last year, is the first time like a lot of people were ever actually like, who is the supply chain? Like, who are these fulfillment center workers and these sailors and other people who actually like move stuff from A to B? Most people haven't really ever had to think about this unless you study it or work in the industry, and it's otherwise pretty invisible to most people. But that said, ports, if you at least are in a port city, are like one of the very few highly visible and highly concentrated sort of nodes of the supply chain. And so when there's these problems, which are not just limited to the ports, it's really easy to point at those things and to point at the only people that you see there, which is us. And so there's been this heaping of blame on us, even though we've been the ones that have actually been trying to clear up cargo, while our employers have found ways to actually like make money off of things like not moving through demurrage fees and other things like that. So they're penalizing and fining truck drivers and other stakeholders like in the entire economy, and are actually making more money now than they ever have. CMA CGM, for example, which is a French-based shipping company, their profits soared from 5.5 million to 567 billion in a 1-year span. So like tenfold profit increases. I don't make 10 times as much money as I did a year ago, but they're all raking in like more money than any of these companies have ever had. So they don't want any disruptions to that. You know, you got to make hay when the sun shines, and the getting's really good for all of our employers. And so they know that actually gives us a lot of leverage. And so we're not going to, sell ourselves short and take an extension when things are actually situated quite well for us to have a good round of bargaining. But it's interesting. I'll just say, especially for all of you that live in Tacoma, you live in a port city. So keep an eye on if picket lines or rallies or anything like that pops up. I will see you there. And thanks in advance.
Thank you for letting us know. That's fascinating.
It's interesting to hear Zach sort of recap of the kind of the rhetorical moves of anti-union sentiment. I feel like it's, that it's the same refrain with teachers, right? Like the fat cats, the people who earn too much, they're lazy. Yeah, I was wondering, we had a question come in a little early since we heard about Zach's sort of work experience. Folks were kind of curious to know more about your work experience prior to writing this book, but also what you're doing now with the Kalmanovitz initiative, but also the collaboration that you've set up with Rutgers.
Sure, happy to talk about all of that. So I used to be a union organizer. I organized in the South in the 1990s. I organized with a union called the Clothing and Textile Workers Union. And I spent my 20s sitting in working people's living rooms across the South, talking to them about, why they wanted to form a union, how to do that. It was a huge lesson to me. I'm Southern. I grew up in Georgia, but I just had incredible experiences meeting working people all over the South and organizing. I then started to work at the National AFL-CIO. Soon after there was a change in leadership. There was a guy named John Sweeney who was elected on an insurgent slate. And I started working there in 1998 doing media work. And it quickly became apparent to me that the public did not know what I had been learned, which is that how hard it is for people to form unions. So eventually I wanted to study more about how it got to be so hard. And I went back to grad school with Will, who's on here somewhere. I went to the University of Maryland. I got a PhD in history and wrote the book. And now I'm at the Kalmanovitz Initiative. And one of my favorite projects there is called Will Empower, Women Innovating Labor Leadership. We have a very broad definition of women, and we have a very broad definition of labor. And we have many different kinds of programs, including cohorts for women who are already in the movement. We have apprenticeships for recent college graduates or rank and file folks who want to be part of the union movement. And we also do a lot of public programming. You can check us out at willempower.org. I'll put a bug in your ear, which is that if any of you are about to graduate from college, or if you are a rank and file activist or somebody who wants to try out a job in the movement, we will begin accepting applications to our apprenticeship program on January 17th for the following fall. And the apprenticeships are all over the country. So it's not just in DC, it's everywhere. So if that's something that interests you, please check us out. That it's not open yet, but it will be in mid-January.
That's great to hear. These are conversations actually Mike and I have had about kind of how to, after we sort of activate our students, how then to sort of send them out into the world and sort of make the changes that they see are necessary. So how long has Will Empower been up and running?
We started it in 2017. So we're now in our 4th year.
Gotcha.
Yep.
And I realize you're on the East Coast. I don't want to keep you up all night, but do you have a couple more minutes for?
Yeah. No, you've got me for a little while now. That's fine.
Because there was one on the chat board that I thought was really interesting. I wanted to circle back to it. Kind of reminded me of a question that came in about 9 to 5 and alt labor. But this one was posed by Ashley, and it reads, what are your thoughts on legislating labor standards instead of pursuing them in collective bargaining agreements? Seattle has 17 ordinances ranging from prohibiting wage theft and guaranteeing sick leave to most workers, to requiring COVID hazard pay for grocery store workers and minimum hourly wages for Uber Lyft drivers. Does it supplant or discourage organizing? Is this a form of worker/union power? And finally, where does it fit within the government employer safety net tensions? Did you have any thoughts on that one? I thought it was a really interesting question.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. So my view is that that is, rather than either or, is yes and. That's where I think where our movement should be, is yes and, right? And so what I mean by that is that I think that, the movement for, whether it's the fight for 15 or the effort to make sure that there's long-term care and that the long-term care workers are paid a decent wage, or efforts to make sure that childcare workers are paid a decent wage, all of these kinds of legislation that you're starting to see, that this absolutely is where we need to go, right? In addition to shoring up workers' ability to form unions. I think you need both, and I think that they need to work in tandem. And so, for instance, there's a lot of discussion about making sure, a lot of the times when you pass legislation that has new standards for work, there's actually nobody overseeing to make sure that those standards are being upheld. And so part of the new law can actually be that you say, okay, not only that, but we're going to have existing worker organizations, unions, or other kinds of worker organizations. We're going to bring them into the process so that they can oversee the implementation of this legislation in the workplace. And so there are ways, I think, that we can build worker power into the efforts to increase legislation. The idea, and some people in the union movement will argue this. They will say, you don't want universal health care because then people won't want the union. They won't need the union anymore they won't need their collective bargaining agreement. Well, that's just crazy, right? In fact, I think that what the entire union movement should be fighting for universal health care. We should be fighting to expand the social safety net. As I described before, what we built in this country was an employer-provided social safety net. It was very narrow. It only dealt with certain issues. And it was only available to those people who could jump through all the hoops to be part of a union. Now, that did help build up unions, right? Because in order to get that social safety net, you had to be part of the unions. But then the employers broke the system because they basically made it so you couldn't get in there. You couldn't get the good social benefits anymore. That limited system, I think we're past its time. That's not to say we're done with collective bargaining. We're not. But that system where you got all the social welfare through the collective bargaining agreement, I just think that we are past that moment and that we have to build many ways for workers to have better lives and build power.
Thanks for bringing that up. That argument always just drives me insane. And also reading down that list, I just as a matter of public record, shout out to State Senator Karen Kaiser, who pretty much has her fingerprints on that every item on that list. She's been absolutely crushing it throughout her entire career.
Yes.
a couple thumbs up in the participant list there. We did have a question about 9 to 5, and because your book is, basically about how difficult it is to form unions these days, people were curious to know a little bit more about both 9 to 5 as kind of a prototype of what would eventually become kind of that alt labor movement, and just how you see, alt labor being, a possible workaround in a political climate where it's not getting any easier to form unions, despite the fact that they've never been more popular, right?
Yeah. So the women of 9 to 5, I call them the foremothers of alt labor, because they were experimenting with ways to build worker power outside of collective bargaining very early, from starting in the early 1970s. So they would do things like do surveys of the entire insurance industry in Boston, and then they would hold big public events to talk about how the workers in Boston were underpaid and put pressure on the company that way. They would do kind of wild things like have bad boss contests where people would write in and talk about how poorly they were treated as women at the workplace, how much sexism there was. And the stories are just amazing. Like one guy who won the bad boss contest was, he had required his secretary to sew up his pants while he was wearing them, right? You know, or the boss who required his secretary to come every day to work and peel like 20 carrots because he was on a diet, right? It was this whole idea of secretary as sort of the office wife. And these women just turned that on its head by making so much fun of it. And, you know, they did actually win, even outside collective bargaining, they did make some monetary gains from the publishing and the insurance industries in Boston. They actually got John Hancock Insurance to subsidize childcare, which was incredible. So they did actually make some monetary gains, but they also really changed the culture in many ways. You know, not alone, obviously. They were part of a feminist movement, of a working class feminist movement. But I think there are people in the labor movement who will say, oh, 9 to 5, well, that's too bad. There was all this fuss about that, but today secretaries don't have unions, so it failed, right? And that drives me crazy because it's like, no, the experience of being a woman in the workplace is fundamentally different than it was in the early 1970s. And they were a major part of changing that. And just because that didn't translate into higher numbers in the Bureau of Labor Statistics union membership numbers does not mean that they did not win. And I think that's really important for us to recognize. We have to think beyond just union membership numbers, right? The fact that union membership in the United States, the private sector union membership is at 6%. That's really, really low. But that doesn't mean that workers can't have power. They absolutely can. And I think that, frankly, I think we're starting to see workers exercise some of that power. Wages actually are going up because people won't take the bad jobs at the poor wages anymore. You know, you're seeing, I think, you know, the strikes are having an impact. I'm thinking of not only the strikes since the pandemic, but in 2018 and 2019, we saw the largest number of workers on strike since the early 1980s. So we had nearly 500,000 workers a year. And I see the strikes that we've been having now, or even the ones that have been threatened, like the IATSE and the Kaiser Permanente ones, are part of this sort of new strike wave that is led by women, and it's led by people of color. And not only that, when you think about the fact that women started to enter the workforce en masse in the 1970s, there were women who worked for wages before that, but 12 million more women were working by the end of the 1970s compared to the beginning, right? The strike wave we are in right now, which has been 2018, 2019, et cetera, is the largest strike wave we've had since women have entered the workforce en masse, right? Think about that. This is it. This is the largest we've seen. And it is in many ways being led by women, like the Red for Ed strikes, the nurses, et cetera. I think we're in the middle of something new. And it's partly based out of the pandemic, but it's also in reaction to the inequality and the terrible jobs that people have been putting up with for too long.
I wonder, I loved in your book, and since Mike's here, how Mike throughout his career has really sought to kind of, reverse that disaggregation of the civil rights movement and the labor movement. And I wonder, now we're kind of like shifting gears to talking about the present day. Where do you see sort of the larger fight for racial justice within,
where do I see what?
The larger fight for racial justice, Black Lives Matter movement. Where do you see that within our current sort of, discussion about the state of American labor? Are we doing, are we kind of honoring that legacy and that connection of sort of civil rights unionism? And if not, how do we do that?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think it is very clear that we are living through a new era of renewed rights consciousness, right? So you see that absolutely in the Black Lives Matter. You see that the women who started the Black Lives Matter had actually, some of them had worked in the Fight for 15 movement. So again, people's reality, their lives are embodying multiple identities and multiple movements and multiple ways of that they're moving forward. I also think you're seeing a rights consciousness when we think about the Me Too movement that was fundamentally based at the workplace, right? When you think about, we were talking about the Hollywood casting couch, the kitchens that people were complaining, that they were being harassed. All it's in many ways it was based in the workplace. When we think about the immigrant rights movements, the day without an immigrant marches that we've had over the last really 15, 20 years, those were general strikes too, right? And so I think we have, for a while now, really since Occupy, I think we've been living through a renewed understanding of class and inequality, and also a renewed rights consciousness.
Yeah, I love that idea of the slow moving general strike. It's kind of one of those things. I mean, I guess you kind of can't accurately assess it until it's in the rearview mirror, right? I see Mike Honey has mentioned his film Love and Solidarity as a great piece. I mean, a great documentary extending civil rights movement, looking at the work of James Lawson and kind of extending the civil rights movement.
Yes, it's my heart.
Lane, you may not know about it, but there's great things happening with Kent Wong and the UCLA Labor Center. They've purchased the building they've been working in for years near MacArthur Park. They got the legislature to put up the money to buy it. I think it was $15 million or something like that. And they're renaming it the James Lawson Worker Justice Center.
Oh, that's wonderful.
On December 10th. And LA I've been working with him. We have a book called Revolutionary Nonviolence, Organizing for Freedom with James Lawson. And they've done some really great stuff by using nonviolent direct action organizing. For about 20 years, they've been teaching these courses and turning out all kinds of great students from UCLA. And I was talking to Kent recently about how they defeated this effort to get rid of Gavin Newsom. He said, well, labor almost controls politics in Los Angeles, and it's diverse. It's exactly what you're talking about. It's this very diverse labor movement. And I think like 50% of the workers in California now are Latinx. And through the civil rights vein, they've really organized people. And it's a real something for people around the country to look at. Where is labor really successful right now? It's in Los Angeles and in California more generally. Also up here, it's pretty good for the same reasons. The Washington State Labor Council has done some great stuff working around race and justice issues within the labor movement. With Bill Fletcher, he came in and we did a whole bunch of work around that. So there's some really great strides being made, both in this area and especially in LA.
Oh, that makes me feel so hopeful. Like, thank you.
Yeah, it is hopeful. Very hopeful.
I did have one question that I just had to ask, and a couple students actually wanted to know more about this. The Pinkerton organizing drive. It's the same security company we associate with busting unions actually managed to organize during the 70s. Has there been any scholarship on this? It's
not on that particular drive. I mean, so guards do organize, right? They do have the right under the National Labor Relations Act to organize. Taft-Hartley forced them. They can't be in mixed units. Like they can't be, if there's a plant guard at a factory, they have to be in a separate unit. But guards do organize. And so the way I found out about that particular election is I was nerding out and literally reading labor board monthly reports. They list all the elections. And I was just like skimming elections in the 1970s and saw that. And I don't know much about it. I know it was in Detroit in 1977, and which is so interesting because when you think about the River Rouge battle, that was Pinkertons on the other side. But sure enough, in 1977, over 300 Pinkerton guards in Detroit organized. But I don't know anything more about it because the only piece of evidence I had was the labor board monthly report. I couldn't find any news on it. I didn't dig that hard though. If there's somebody who's looking for a good project, that could be one.
That sounds like one of those, up late at night working over a list, and what was that? Is that the Pinkertons? Well, if the Pinkertons can do it, we can do it, right? Excellent. Well, we're approaching 7:30 here on the West Coast. So and I think we've gotten through most of the questions that were submitted ahead of time and the chat board. So unless anybody has any last minute submissions, I'll give people a moment to type if that is the case. I could start, already, just thanking you, and this was absolutely amazing. Like I said, we screened the documentary 9 to 5: The Story of a Movement back in the spring, and so the fact, now we've got somebody who was in the documentary joining us to share this work, I think is, it's amazing. It's important. It fills so many gaps in terms of our understanding of 20th century labor history, and I think it's just an honor to host you. And I mean, you could probably tell by the people who've shown up for this that we out here in Tacoma really appreciate you. And if you ever make it out to Tacoma in a non-Zoom format, I'm sure there'd be a number of people who'd love to take you out and show you around.
I've never been there, so hopefully one day I'll be able to come.
Nice.
Yes. So thank you. I've enjoyed the conversation, and what I think we're living in an exciting moment. I do. There's always backlash. We have to keep that in mind. There's always backlash, but I do think we're living through a historic moment for working people.
Yeah, I mean, you see numbers, 77% of 18 to 34-year-olds supporting unions. I mean, that's huge. I mean, how can you deny it?